In this short video, I want to introduce the book of 1 Samuel. It comes as the fourth book of the 12 historical books in the Old Testament. The first three, Joshua, Judges and Ruth, describe the period of the Judges, when a charismatic type prophetic people led God's people. In 1 Samuel, we see God doing something else. We see the birthing of a dynasty. It's the story of the development of God's people, God's dealings with God's people, and it is complicated. If you were writing a history of a nation, you wouldn't start with a woman praying to have a baby. You would start somewhere else. But that's where the writer of 1 Samuel does start. Because Hannah enters into the matriarchal experience of Sarah and Rebecca and the early wives of the patriarchs in her struggle to have children. God has made a promise to Abraham that through him and his descendants all the nations of the world will be blessed. And that is where the writer of 1 Samuel starts. It is about the birthing of a dynasty. It starts with the ending of the era of the judges. Eli is a corrupt priest, and so are his sons. And the ministry at Shiloh is corrupt, and it comes to an end. It ends disastrously. But in that context, a young boy, Hannah's son, is given this most remarkable prophetic anointing, probably arguably one of the greatest in the whole of the Bible. And Samuel is used by God to be the sort of catalyst of this change from God's people being governed by these charismatic prophetic leaders through into the dynasty of monarchy. But it's highly problematic, and in that context Saul is anointed as king, but he's a bully, he's a tyrant, things are going wrong, he makes a lot of what he does is really good, but it's not the way God wants, and it quickly gets complicated in all kinds of ways. And in that context, God then anoints David. And Samuel goes to David and anoints him because he's a man after God's own heart. And so the second part of 1 Samuel is all about David being prepared for kingship. And it's an extraordinary process. He both succeeds in almost everything he does, but he also is bullied by Saul, and it's bad. And things get very, very difficult. And David's own progression is highly complicated. But it reaches a pivotal point in just before the last chapter 30, verse 6, where it says, at a point of really a crucial difficulty, where even David's men are set on killing him. It looks like everything's going wrong. It says, but David found strength in the Lord his God. Chapter 30, verse 6. That's the turning point, and from that, everything begins to fall into place and progresses to the point where David is not just king of Israel, of God's people, but he's one of the greatest kings, arguably the greatest, that lived at that time in that part of Israel's history. And so we have an extraordinary book here. We have a history book, but it's written from the perspective of God's promise to Abraham and to his people. And what we see here is God, the Spirit of God, preparing and forming David to be king. It's a remarkable book. It speaks deeply into what it means to be a disciple and how we see God preparing people for the ministry and the work that he calls us into.